They took his ranch before the sun even cleared the hills, and he never once reached for his gun. The morning air was still cold, carrying that thin smell of dust and dry wood, the kind that settles deep in your chest and stays there. And Ethan Cole stood beside a fence that wasn't his anymore, watching men he didn't know drive his cattle through the gate like it had always belonged to them, like his name had never been carved into that land in the first place. 12 years. That's how long it took him to build something quiet enough to survive out here, and it only took one night to lose it. The paper they nailed into the post flapped in the wind, a sharp sound, like it was reminding him this was real. No shouting, no fighting, just signatures and silence. That's how things were taken now. He kept his hands loose at his sides, boots planted in the dirt his father once told him would outlive them both. And for a moment, just a moment, he almost laughed at that. Because the land doesn't remember names. Only men do. And men forget quick when there's money involved. A horse snorted nearby, restless, as one of the buyers tightened a rope too hard, not out of cruelty, just impatience, the kind that comes from thinking everything in front of you is already yours. Ethan didn't move, didn't say a word, because none of this surprised him. Not really. He'd seen it coming the second he opened that door the night before. She had been leaning against the fence when he found her, about 30 yards from the house, barely standing, one hand pressed to her side, dress torn just enough to tell a story without saying a word. The wind pulled at her hair, dark against the fading light, and when she looked up at him, there was no panic there, no pleading, just something quieter, something that didn't belong to someone about to collapse in the dirt. "Don't let them find me," she said, voice low, steady in a way that didn't match the blood on her sleeve. That was it. No explanation. No name. Just that one sentence, hanging between them like a choice already made. Ethan had stood there for a second longer than most men would. Long enough to understand exactly what it would cost him. Because out here, strangers don't arrive alone. Trouble rides with them, just a few miles behind. He glanced once toward the horizon, nothing but open land and fading light, and then back at her. And something in the way she didn't beg made the decision for him. He stepped forward. Slow. Careful. Like approaching a wounded animal that might still run. "You can stand?" he asked. She didn't answer, just held his gaze. So he reached out anyway. That's when everything started slipping away. Back in the present, the last of his horses disappeared beyond the ridge, hooves fading into the distance, and the yard felt bigger than it ever had, empty in a way that echoed. Ethan turned his head slightly, eyes catching on the porch where the door still hung open, just enough for the wind to push it back and forth with a soft, hollow knock. Inside, the fire from last night had long gone cold. But there was something else. Something he hadn't touched yet, sitting on the table where she'd left it. Small, quiet, waiting. And for the first time since they took everything, Ethan moved. The house felt different without the sound of animals, without the slow rhythm of hooves and wind moving through the barn, like something essential had been pulled out and taken with it. And Ethan stepped inside with that same steady pace he had carried all morning, boots brushing dust across the wooden floor as the door gave one last hollow knock behind him. The table sat where it always had, worn edges, a faint ring mark from a coffee cup long gone cold, and right in the center of it, untouched, was the thing she left behind, small enough to ignore if you did not know better, heavy enough that you could not. A silver ring, dull from travel, but carved with a pattern that did not belong to any town he had ever passed through. Not a brand, not a family mark, something older, something that had weight without asking for it. Ethan stood over it for a moment, not reaching, just looking, because he had learned a long time ago that the smallest things out here usually carried the biggest trouble, and then he picked it up anyway. The metal was cold, colder than the air, like it had been, waiting longer than a single night. And when he turned it in his fingers, the light from the window caught along the edges of the carving, clean lines, precise, not something made in a hurry, not something given to someone by accident. He exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing just a fraction, then slipped it into his pocket without another word, like he had already decided it was not worth thinking about, even though it was the only thing left in a house that no longer belonged to him. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying distant voices, men finishing their work, tying up loose ends, making sure nothing remained that could be called his. And Ethan stepped back out onto the porch, letting the light hit his face as if it might tell him what came next. But the land stayed quiet, same as always, offering nothing. He walked past the empty corral, past the post where the paper still flapped in uneven rhythm, and kept going until the house sat behind him like something already forgotten. Because standing there would not bring it back, and looking at it would only make it harder to leave. The road stretched out ahead, dry and pale, cutting through miles of nothing, the kind of path a man takes when there is nowhere left to return to. And Ethan adjusted his hat slightly, not out of habit, but because the sun had climbed higher now, sharp against his eyes, and for the first time since morning, he allowed himself to slow, just enough to think. He had seen fear before, in men, in animals, in people who knew they were about to lose something they could not replace. But what he saw in her eyes the night before was not fear, not exactly. It was something steadier, like she already understood how things would end and had chosen her part in it anyway. And that did not sit right with him now, not with the way everything had unfolded too clean, too fast, like pieces moving into place before he even knew there was a game being played. His hand brushed lightly against his pocket. As he walked, feeling the outline of the ring through the fabric, a small, constant reminder that the night before had not been something he imagined, and that whatever she carried with her when she arrived had not left with her when she disappeared. A distant sound reached him then, faint at first, like wind catching on rock, but different, more rhythmic, something that did not belong to empty land. And Ethan stopped, turning his head slightly toward the horizon, eyes narrowing against the light, because out here, you learned to listen before you saw anything, and whatever was coming now was not the kind of thing that passed by unnoticed. The sound came again, clearer this time, not wind, not loose wood, but hooves, steady and measured, more than one, more than a few, and Ethan did not move right away. He just stood there in the middle of the road with the sun pressing down on his shoulders, listening the way a man does when he has already lost everything and has nothing left to rush for. The rhythm carried across the open land in slow waves, rising and falling, like something deliberate, something that knew exactly where it was going, and Ethan turned just enough to face it, squinting into the light as the horizon began to shift, a faint line at first, then shapes, then silhouettes cutting through the heat. He had seen riders before, plenty of them, drifters, traders, men chasing work or trouble, but this was different. There was no scatter in their movement, no uneven spacing. They held formation without trying, like they had ridden together for miles without speaking, and the dust behind them rose in a single, wide trail instead of breaking apart. Ethan slid his hand into his pocket, not out of fear, just habit, fingers brushing against the ring again, and something about the weight of it felt heavier now, like it was no longer just a piece of metal, but a question he had not asked yet. The riders did not slow as they approached, but they did not rush either. Their pace stayed even, controlled, until the distance between them closed enough for details to form. Dark coats, clean lines, hats set low against the sun, and none of them looked like men who had come to argue or negotiate. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, boots settling deeper into the dirt, not defensive, just grounded, because whatever this was, it was not passing by. The first rider pulled ahead of the others by a few yards, not breaking formation, just leading it. And for a moment the light caught along the edge of something at his chest, metal, polished, official, but not from any office Ethan had ever respected. And then the rest fanned out just enough to reveal their number. More than 10, more than 20, enough that the road behind them seemed to disappear. Still, no one spoke, no one reached for anything. The silence stretched between them and Ethan like a held breath, and he realized then that this was not about force, not about taking, because that had already been done. This was something else, something quieter and far more certain. The lead rider slowed to a stop about 30 feet away, close enough to be heard without raising his voice, far enough to keep the space between them intact. And when he looked at Ethan, there was no anger there, no accusation, just recognition, like he had expected to find him standing exactly where he was. "You helped her," the man said, not a question, just a statement laid flat against the moment. And Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes flicking once toward the rest of the riders, all watching, all waiting, and then back to the man in front of him. "I opened a door," Ethan said finally, voice even, like he was talking about something that had already passed beyond his control, and the rider studied him for a second longer, then gave the smallest nod, like that answer had settled something important. Behind him, the others shifted just slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to change the shape of the group, and Ethan caught a glimpse then, something further behind, another figure, not moving with the same rigid stillness as the rest, something softer in the posture, something familiar in the way the horse carried its rider. The wind picked up again, lifting dust between them, blurring the edges just enough that Ethan had to narrow his eyes to see clearly, and for the first time since the riders appeared, something in his chest tightened, not fear, not exactly, but recognition trying to find its place. His hand pressed lightly against his pocket, feeling the ring again, and as the dust settled just enough to reveal the shape behind the line of men, Ethan understood one thing with a quiet certainty. Whatever was happening now had been set in motion long before those papers were nailed to his fence. The dust settled just enough for the shape to become a person, and Ethan did not need the light to tell him who it was, because some things do not leave a man once he has seen them clearly. She rode forward without urgency, not trying to command attention, yet every rider behind her shifted without being told, opening a path as naturally as wind moving through tall grass. And Clara Whitmore came into view the way the morning comes after a long night, quiet, certain, impossible to ignore. She wore no sign of weakness now, no trace of the woman who leaned against his fence with blood on her sleeve, her posture straight, her gaze level, and the space around her felt different, like it belonged to her whether anyone admitted it or not. Ethan did not step forward, did not step back. He just watched as she brought her horse to a stop a few yards behind the first rider, close enough that he could see her eyes clearly, the same eyes that had looked at him across a small fire, measuring, steady, never asking. For a moment, no one spoke, not the men, not the wind, not even the animals, and in that silence, the distance between what had happened and what was happening now seemed to fold in on itself, like the night before had never really ended. Clara's gaze moved over him once, taking in the dust on his coat, the empty road behind him, the absence of everything he used to stand in front of, and something softened there, just slightly, not pity, not regret, something closer to recognition. She dismounted without breaking eye contact, boots touching the ground with a quiet certainty that echoed louder than any voice could, and as she stepped forward, the riders behind her held their position, not guarding, not threatening, simply present, like a line drawn that no one needed to cross. "You should not have opened that door," she said, her voice the same as before, low, controlled, carrying just enough weight to reach him without effort, and Ethan let the words settle. Before answering, his tone even, like he was speaking about weather or distance, something that had already happened and could not be undone. "You already knew I would," he replied, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not surprise, but acknowledgement, like a truth spoken out loud had finally found its place. She took another step closer, close enough now that the wind no longer stood between them, and her eyes flicked briefly to his hand, to the pocket where the ring rested, then back to his face. "They took everything," she said, not as a question, but as a statement she had already confirmed, and Ethan gave the smallest nod, not adding anything to it, because there was nothing left to explain. Behind her, one of the riders moved slightly, reaching into a satchel and pulling out a folded document, thick paper, sealed, official in a way that did not come from the men who had stood on his land that morning, and he held it there, waiting, not stepping forward until Clara gave the slightest motion of her hand. The man approached then, stopping a few feet from Ethan, extending the paper without a word, and Ethan did not take it right away, his eyes shifting from the document to Clara, searching for something that did not need to be said. "What is this?" he asked quietly, not suspicion, not hope, just a question placed carefully between them, and Clara held his gaze as she answered, her voice steady, carrying that same quiet certainty that had followed her since the moment he found her. "Something that was always yours," she said, and the wind moved again, lifting the edge of the paper just enough to reveal a seal pressed deep into the surface, a mark that carried more weight than any voice raised in anger, and for a moment, Ethan did not move, because out here, a man learns that the things that change everything rarely look like much at first glance. And yet somehow, this one did. The paper did not look like much in the man's hand, just thick stock and a clean fold. But Ethan had seen enough documents in his life to know when one carried weight. And this one did not bend in the wind the way the others had that morning. It held firm, like it belonged to something that did not ask permission. He reached out slowly, fingers rough from years of work closing around the edge. And when he took it, the rider stepped back without a word, returning to his place as if nothing had passed between them at all. Ethan did not open it right away. He just stood there with it in his hand, feeling the weight settle, the same way he had felt the ring settle in his pocket earlier. And for a brief moment, everything went quiet again, like the land itself was waiting to see what he would do next. Clara did not rush him, did not speak. She simply watched, her presence steady, unchanged, and that silence between them carried more meaning than any explanation could have. Finally, Ethan broke the seal with his thumb, the sound small but sharp in the still air, and unfolded the paper with care, eyes moving across the lines slowly, not because he could not read, but because he understood that whatever was written there would not be undone once. It was known. The words were clear, precise, written in a hand that did not tolerate error, and the seal pressed into the bottom corner caught the light again. Official, recognized, carrying authority that did not come from the men who had stood on his land earlier. And as he read, something shifted in his expression, not shock, not disbelief, something deeper, something quieter, like a truth finally stepping out of the shadows where it had been waiting. He lowered the paper just slightly, eyes lifting to Clara, searching her face for confirmation that he was not misreading what sat in his hands. And she gave the smallest nod, not dramatic, not proud, just enough to say that yes, it was real, and yes, it had always been there. They never owned it. Ethan said, voice low, more to himself than to her, and the words carried across the space like a realization that had taken years to arrive. Clara stepped forward then, closing the last few feet between them, her boots leaving faint marks in the dust that had not yet settled, and when she spoke, her voice held that same calm certainty that had followed her from the beginning. They counted on you not knowing, she said, and there was no anger in it, only fact, only the simple shape of how things had been allowed to happen. Ethan looked back down at the document, reading the line again, the one that changed everything, the one that traced ownership not to the men who had taken it, but to a name older than all of them, a name that had been buried under assumption and silence. And for a moment, he saw his father standing in that yard years ago, speaking about land and legacy and things that did not get written down the way they should. The wind shifted again, lifting the edge of the paper, and behind Clara, the riders remained still, waiting, not pressing forward, not claiming anything, just holding the space like witnesses to something that had already been decided. Ethan folded the paper carefully, not rushing, not treating it like a victory, because it did not feel like one, not yet, and he slid it into his coat beside the ring, the two objects resting close now, as if they had always belonged together. Why? He asked finally, the single word carrying everything he had not said since she arrived, not accusation, not gratitude, just a question placed between them with the same steadiness he had shown when he opened that door. Clara held his gaze for a long moment, the wind moving a loose strand of her hair across her face, and when she answered, her voice was softer than before, but no less certain. Because you did not ask, she said, and the meaning of it settled slowly, like dust finding its place after a long ride. And in that moment, Ethan understood something he had not seen clearly before, that what he had given her the night before had not been shelter, not really. It had been trust without condition, and out here, that was worth more than land, more than cattle, more than anything a man could lose and count again. He glanced once toward the empty stretch where his ranch had stood, then back to Clara, and for the first time since morning, the weight in his chest shifted, not gone, but different, like something that had been taken had quietly found its way back, even if it did not look the same as before. The wind moved slower now, like it had nothing left to prove, carrying only the faint scent of dry grass and distant earth, and Ethan stood there with Clara just a few feet away, the document resting against his chest inside his coat. the ring still pressed in his pocket. Both of them heavier now than when he first held them, not because of what they were made of, but because of what they meant. Behind her, the riders remained in place, silent as stone, but something had changed in the way they held themselves. Not rigid anymore, not waiting for instruction, more like men who had already seen the end of a story and knew their part in it was nearly done. Ethan glanced past Clara toward the land that used to carry his name. The fences still standing, the house still there, nothing physically gone, and yet everything had been taken that morning with a few signatures and a hammer against wood, and now, just as quietly, it had been given back without a single raised voice. He let out a slow breath, not relief, not yet, just the release of something held too long, and his eyes returned to Clara, searching again, not for answers this time, but for understanding. "You knew this would happen," he said, his voice calm, steady, not accusing, just placing the truth between them the way he had done before, and Clara did not look away, did not deny it. She simply held his gaze and let the silence stretch long enough for the meaning to settle on its own. "I knew what they would try," she answered finally, her tone even, carrying no pride in it, no satisfaction, only the weight of something she had seen many times before. "I did not know what you would do." And that was where her voice shifted, just slightly, enough that Ethan noticed, enough that it mattered. He tilted his head a fraction, considering that, because out here, a man's choices are usually predictable, shaped by survival, by fear, by what he can afford to lose, and yet he had stepped forward anyway, opened that door without asking for a name or a reason, and somehow that had been the one thing she could not account for. Most would have turned away, she continued, her eyes flicking briefly toward the empty stretch of land behind him, then back. Most would have asked questions first, or waited for someone else to take the risk. And Ethan almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but because it sounded like something he had heard before, long ago, from a man who believed that doing what was right rarely came with time to think it through. He shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the dirt, grounding himself in the moment, and his hand brushed once more against his coat, feeling both the ring and the paper, the past and the present resting side by side. "You left before sunrise," he said, not as a complaint, not even as curiosity, just stating the fact that had started everything that followed, and Clara nodded once, a small motion, but certain. "If I stayed," she said, "they would have taken more than your land." And the words carried a quiet gravity that did not need explanation, because Ethan understood enough to know that some consequences do not stop where they begin. The wind lifted again, catching the edge of her coat this time, and for a brief second, the distance between who she had been the night before and who she stood as now became clear, not a change, but a reveal, like something hidden in plain sight finally stepping into the light. One of the riders shifted behind her, not impatient, just aware that time was moving, and Clara glanced back for the briefest moment before returning her attention to Ethan. "There is one more thing," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less steady, and she reached into her coat slowly, deliberately, drawing out something small, something familiar in shape, and as she held it out toward him, the sunlight caught along its edge in the same way it had on the table that morning, and Ethan felt his breath pause, just slightly, because whatever she was about to place in his hand was not something he had lost, but something he had never known he was missing until now. The object in Clara's hand caught the light the same way the ring had, but this one was not worn smooth by time. It was clean, deliberate, and when she held it out, she did not speak right away, as if the silence itself carried part of the meaning. Ethan did not reach for it immediately, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he studied the shape. A small leather case, no larger than his palm, stitched along the edges with a precision that did not belong to something ordinary, and for a moment, the wind seemed to pull back, leaving the space between them still, untouched. "It was never meant to leave your family," Clara said finally, her voice low, steady, and something in those words settled deeper than anything she had said before, because they did not sound like a favor. They sounded like a correction. Ethan stepped forward then, closing the last bit of distance, and when he took the case from her hand, their fingers brushed for the briefest second, not lingering, not hesitant, just enough to confirm that this moment was real and not something imagined in the quiet after loss. The leather felt warm, as if it had been held long enough to carry its own weight, and he turned it over once before opening it, careful, deliberate, like a man who understood that some things do not need force to reveal themselves. Inside, resting against the worn lining, was a folded document and a smaller piece of metal, darker than the ring, older, marked with a seal he recognized in a way that did not come from memory, but from something deeper, something passed down without words. His breath slowed as he lifted it, the edges worn just enough to show it had lived through more than one lifetime. And when he turned it toward the light, the engraving became clear, a family mark, not the one others had used to claim his land, but the one that had been spoken quietly in his house when he was a boy, the one his father had never shown in public, only in stories told when the fire burned low and the world outside felt far away. Ethan did not speak, not right away, because the weight of it pressed against something he had not touched in years, something he had learned to live without questioning, and now it stood in front of him, undeniable, placed in his hand without condition. Clara watched him, not interrupting, not explaining further, because she understood that this part did not belong to her. It belonged to him and whatever he chose to see in it. Behind her, the riders remained still, their presence unchanged, but no longer imposing, more like witnesses to something that had already found its place. Ethan lowered the piece of metal slowly, eyes lifting back to Clara, searching for something that would connect all of this into a single line he could follow, and she gave him that with a single sentence, quiet but certain. "Your father knew," she said, and that was all it took. The words did not need to be expanded. They carried their own meaning, filling the spaces that had been left empty. For years, and Ethan felt it then, not anger, not regret, but clarity, the kind that comes when pieces finally align after being scattered too long. He closed the case carefully, not rushing, and held it for a moment longer before slipping it into his coat beside the document and the ring, all three resting together now, not separate things, but parts of the same truth. The wind moved again, softer this time, carrying the faint sound of leather shifting behind Clara as one of the riders adjusted his seat, and Ethan glanced past her once more, seeing not just the men, but the distance they had traveled, the intention in the way they had arrived, and the silence they had kept. "You brought all this back," he said, not as praise, not even as surprise, just acknowledging what stood in front of him, and Clara shook her head slightly, the smallest motion, but enough to shift the meaning. "No," she said, her voice steady. "It was always yours," and the way she said it left no room for anything else. Ethan looked down the road behind him, then back toward the land that had nearly slipped from his hands, and for the first time since the morning began, the space between what was lost and what remained no longer felt empty. It felt like something waiting to be understood, something he had only just begun to see. The weight of the case settled against Ethan's chest like something that had finally found its place after years of being carried by the wrong hands. And for a long moment he said nothing, just stood there with the wind moving lightly across the open land, his eyes drifting past Clara toward the ranch in the distance. The same fences, the same house. Nothing changed, and yet everything different now that he understood what had always been there. He took a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he realizes the past has been speaking to him all along, and he simply did not know how to listen. And when he looked back at Clara, there was something steadier in his gaze, not confusion anymore, not even surprise, just a quiet recognition that whatever had brought her to his fence had not been chance. "You were not running," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful-like. He was placing the last piece into a puzzle he had not known he was solving, and Clara held his gaze without flinching, without rushing to explain, because she knew he would reach it on his own. "No," she answered after a moment, her tone calm, carrying no apology. "I was making sure it reached the right hands," and the words settled into the space between them with a weight that did not need to be repeated. Ethan glanced down at his coat briefly, feeling the three objects resting there, the ring, the document, the case, each one a part of something larger than the sum of its pieces. And for the first time since the morning began, he understood that what had been taken from him had never truly been his to lose, not in the way he had believed, because ownership out here was not always written in ink. Sometimes it was carried in silence, passed down in ways that only revealed themselves when everything else was stripped away. Behind Clara, one of the riders shifted again, and this time the movement carried a subtle change through the group, not tension, not urgency, but completion, like men who knew their work was done and were only waiting for the final moment to pass. Ethan noticed it. The way they no longer held formation as tightly, the way the air around them felt lighter, and he looked back to Clara, studying her in a way he had not allowed himself to before, not as a stranger, not as someone who arrived in need, but as someone who had carried a responsibility far heavier than anything he had imagined. You could have handed it to anyone, he said, not accusing, just stating the truth as he saw it, because there were men in towns, in offices, in places where documents like that belonged. Men who would have known what to do with it without losing everything first. And Clara's expression shifted just slightly. Not disagreement, not correction, something closer to certainty. Anyone would have asked questions, she said, her voice quiet, but firm. And questions change things. And Ethan let that sit for a second, because he knew she was right. He had not asked, not about her name, not about where she came from, not about what trouble followed her. He had simply opened the door, and in doing so, he had left something intact that others would have broken without realizing it. The wind picked up again, lifting a thin trail of dust between them, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them standing in that open space, everything else fading into the distance. And Ethan felt something settle inside him, not relief, not quite, but a kind of understanding that did not need to be explained out loud. What happens now, he asked. Finally, the question simple, but carrying everything that came after this moment, everything that would follow once the riders turned and the dust settled again. And Clara looked past him briefly, toward the ranch, then back, her eyes steady, her answer just as simple. Now, she said, you decide what it was worth. And there was no instruction in it, no expectation, just a quiet truth placed in his hands the same way she had placed everything else. And as the riders behind her began to shift, turning their horses slowly toward the horizon they had come from, Ethan stood there with the weight of it all resting against his chest, understanding at last that what he had lost had been measured in acres and cattle, but what he had been given could not be counted that way at all. The riders began to turn one by one, not in a rush, not with any signal spoken aloud, just a quiet shift that moved through them like wind across tall grass. And the sound of leather and reins replaced the silence they had carried with them, soft, controlled, already fading into distance before they had fully left. Ethan watched them go without following, his eyes tracing the line they formed as they moved back toward the horizon, a path that would disappear within minutes as if they had never been there at all, and yet the dust they left behind lingered, hanging in the air like a reminder that something had passed through this place and changed it without breaking anything. Clara did not move with them right away. She remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence still anchored in the space between what had been taken and what had just been returned. And Ethan felt that moment stretch. Not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just unfinished. He shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing deeper into the dirt that now carried a different meaning than it had that morning, and his hand rested briefly against his coat again, feeling the case, the ring, the document, each one steady against him like quiet proof that what had happened was not something that would fade when the dust settled. You are leaving, he said, not asking, not stopping her, just acknowledging the direction things were already moving, and Clara gave a small nod, her eyes still on him, still measuring in that same quiet way that had never felt like judgment. This was never mine to keep, she replied, her voice calm, carrying no hesitation. And there was something in the way she said it that made it clear she was not speaking only about the land, not only about the things she had placed back into his hands, but about the moment itself, about whatever had existed between them since the night before. Ethan, let that settle, because out here, people come and go without leaving much behind, and yet sometimes they leave something that does not show itself until later, something that stays long after the person is gone. He looked past her once more, the last of the riders now smaller against the horizon, their figures blending into the distance, and then back to her, standing alone now in the space they had once filled, and for a second, the thought crossed his mind that he could ask her to stay, that He could turn this moment into something else, something more permanent. But the thought passed just as quickly as it came, because he understood enough now to know that some things lose their meaning the moment you try to hold on to them. "You trusted me," he said instead, the words simple, but carrying more weight than anything he had said so far, and Clara's expression shifted just slightly. Not surprise, not denial, something closer to acknowledgement, like she had been waiting for him to say it out loud. "You made that easy," she answered, and there was no pride in it, no self-importance. Just the plain truth of it laid gently between them. The wind moved again, lifting a strand of her hair, carrying the faint sound of the riders now nearly gone, and for a moment, the world felt wider, quieter, like it had made space for something new without announcing it. Ethan nodded once, not because there was anything left to agree on, but because it felt right to mark the moment in some small way, and he took a step back, giving her the space to move, to leave on her own terms the same way she had arrived. Clara held his gaze for one last second, long enough that it did not feel rushed, not so long that it lingered, and then she turned, her movement smooth, unforced, as she walked back to her horse, the distance between them growing with each step, not heavy, not empty, just natural, like something that had completed its course. Ethan watched as she mounted, as she guided the horse toward the same horizon the others had taken, and he did not follow, did not call out. He simply stood there, alone again, but not the same as before, because the silence that settled around him now carried something different, something earned. When she disappeared into the distance, the dust finally fell, the wind softened, and the land returned to what it had always been, open, quiet, waiting, and Ethan turned slowly back toward the ranch, toward the house that still stood, the fences that still marked the ground, and he took his first step forward, not to reclaim what was his, but to understand what it truly meant to have it back. The path back to the ranch felt longer than it had that morning, not because the distance had changed, but because every step now carried weight, not the kind that drags a man down, but the kind that makes him pay attention to where he is going, and Ethan walked it slowly, boots pressing into the same dirt that had watched everything unfold without taking sides. The house came into view first, quiet, unchanged, the door still slightly open, moving with the wind in that same soft rhythm. And for a moment he stopped just short of the fence line, not out of hesitation, but out of something closer to respect, like a man returning to a place he thought he had already lost. The paper nailed to the post still hung there, edges worn by the breeze, its authority already gone, reduced to nothing more than ink on wood. And Ethan reached up, pulling it free with a single motion, the nail slipping out without resistance, as if even the land had decided it no longer belonged there. He did not look at it again, just folded it once and set it aside on the post, not as a trophy, not as a reminder, but as something finished, inside the house. The air held the faint scent of ash and wood, the remnants of a night that now felt like it belonged to another life, and Ethan stepped in, letting the door fall shut behind him without force, the sound soft, final in a way that did not need to be repeated. He moved to the table where everything had begun, where the ring had first been left behind, and for a moment, he simply stood there, placing his hand against the worn surface, feeling the grooves, the marks left by years of use, by meals eaten alone, by choices made without witness. Slowly, he reached into his coat, taking out the ring first, setting it down in the same spot it had been before, then the folded document, placing it beside it, and finally the small leather case, resting it gently next to the others, the three objects forming a line that told a story no one else had been there to see. He looked at them for a long moment, not trying to rush what they meant, because some things take time to settle, even when the truth is already clear. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing against the walls, carrying the distant echo of open land, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is no longer standing at the edge of something, but already inside it. He picked up the document again, unfolding it carefully, eyes moving across the lines once more, not to confirm, but to understand, to see it not as something given back, but as something that had always been his, waiting for the right moment to return. His gaze moved then to the ring, its worn edges catching the light differently now that he knew what it represented, not just a mark, but a connection, something that tied him to a past he had never fully seen, and finally to the case, still closed, still holding whatever remained to be understood. He rested his hand on it briefly, not opening it again, not yet, because there was no need to rush what had already found its way to him. The room stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty, but full, like a pause between moments that matter, and Ethan turned toward the window, looking out across the land that stretched beyond the fence, the same horizon, the same sky, but not the same man standing beneath it. He did not smile, did not speak. He simply stood there, steady, grounded, knowing that whatever came next would not be decided by what he had lost, but by what he now understood. And in that stillness, with the dust settled and the world returned to its quiet rhythm, Ethan Cole began, for the first time, to see his own land not as something he owned, but as something he had finally earned. The light shifted across the table as the afternoon moved forward, slow and steady, tracing the edges of the ring, the document, and the leather case like it was measuring time in silence. And Ethan remained where he stood, not restless, not waiting, just present in a way he had not been before. He reached for the ring again, turning it between his fingers, feeling the worn edges, the subtle grooves that spoke of years carried by someone who understood its meaning long before he ever did. And, for a moment, he could almost hear his father's voice, not clearly, not in words, but in the tone of those quiet evenings when stories were told without expectation that they would be believed. He set the ring back down carefully and picked up the document once more, his eyes tracing the lines not to confirm ownership, but to understand responsibility, because the words now felt different, heavier, like they were asking something of him instead of simply giving something back. Outside, a faint sound drifted in through the window, distant, uneven, not the organized rhythm of riders, but something looser, less certain, and Ethan turned his head slightly, listening the way a man does when he has learned that quiet does not always mean stillness. The sound grew clearer, hooves again, but scattered this time, and voices, not raised, but present, carrying across the open land in pieces that did not quite form a whole. Ethan stepped away from the table, moving toward the door without urgency, and when he opened it, the light outside had softened, stretching shadows across the yard that now felt both familiar and new. Down the road, a small group of men approached, not more than 4 or 5, their horses moving without formation, their posture lacking the discipline of the riders who had come before, and Ethan recognized one of them almost immediately, a man who had stood at the edge of his property that morning, watching as the papers were nailed into place, saying nothing, but seeing everything. They slowed as they reached the fence, not crossing it, not yet, and for a moment, no one spoke, the air between them carrying the weight of what had already happened and what could follow. Ethan stepped forward just enough to close the distance without leaving his ground, his stance calm, his gaze steady. And the man at the front shifted in his saddle, not uncomfortable, but aware. "We heard," the man said finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of the certainty it had carried that morning, and Ethan did not ask what they had heard, because it was already clear: the land, the document, the riders who had come and gone without raising their voices. The man glanced briefly toward the house, then back to Ethan, and there was something in his expression now that had not been there earlier. Not respect exactly, but something close enough to matter. "Those papers," he continued, pausing slightly as if choosing his words with care, "they were not right." And the admission hung there, simple, unguarded, and for a moment, the wind carried it across the yard like something that could not be taken back once spoken. Ethan held his gaze, not pressing, not accepting, just letting the truth stand on its own, because out here, a man's words mean more when they are not forced. One of the others shifted behind the speaker, glancing at the land, at the fences, at the house that had nearly been taken, and then back at Ethan, as if trying to understand how everything had changed without anyone raising a hand. "You going to stay?" the first man asked after a moment, and this time there was no assumption in it, no claim, just a question that acknowledged the answer was not theirs to decide. Ethan looked past them briefly, out across the stretch of land that now carried a different weight, then back, and his answer came without hesitation, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. "It was never about leaving," he said. and the words settled into the space between them like something that had always been true, whether anyone had recognized it or not. The men did not argue, did not question further. They simply nodded, small, quiet acknowledgments, and after a moment, they turned their horses, not rushing away, just moving on, leaving the yard as they had found it, but not the same as before. Ethan watched them go until the sound of hooves faded into the distance, and then he turned back toward the house, toward the table where the three objects still rested, waiting, and as he stepped inside once more, the quiet that greeted him did not feel like emptiness. It felt like something beginning to take shape. The room held its quiet like a promise, not empty, not waiting, but settled in a way that made every small movement matter. And Ethan stepped back toward the table where the ring, the document, and the leather case still rested in the fading light, their shadows stretching longer now across the worn wood, like time itself was giving them more space. He did not rush, did not reach for anything right away. He simply stood there, letting the silence speak in the way it only can when a man has finally stopped trying to fill it. Outside, the wind had softened, carrying only the distant call of open land. No riders, no voices, just the steady rhythm of a place returning to itself, and Ethan felt that same rhythm settle into him. Slow, grounded, real. His hand moved first to the case, fingers resting on the leather before opening it again, not out of urgency, but out of understanding, because there was something in it he had not fully seen before, something that had waited until now to be noticed. He unfolded the inner document carefully, eyes tracing the lines with a different kind of attention than before, not searching for proof, but for meaning. And there, in the margin, written in a hand that did not belong to Clara, not to any official he recognized, was a note, small, almost easy to miss, but clear enough once seen. He leaned closer, the light catching just enough for the words to form, and as he read them, his breath slowed, not in surprise, but in recognition, the kind that reaches deeper than thought. It was not long, just a single line, written with intention, not for the world, but for the one who would understand it when the time came. And though the name was not signed, Ethan knew it without needing to see it. The same way he had known the mark on the metal, the same way he had recognized the truth in Clara's voice. He lowered the paper slightly, his eyes drifting toward the window, toward the land beyond it, and for a moment, the years folded back on themselves, not as memory, but as something clearer, something that had always been there beneath everything he had believed. You will know when it is time. The line had said, simple, direct, carrying no explanation, and now, standing in that quiet room with everything returned and nothing left to chase, Ethan understood that it had never been about losing the ranch. Not truly. It had been about seeing it, about knowing what it meant when it could no longer be taken for granted. He folded the paper again, more carefully this time, placing it back into the case with a steadiness that came from something settled deep inside him. And when he closed it, the sound was soft, final in a way that did not need to be repeated. His hand moved next to the ring, lifting it once more, feeling its weight as something familiar now, something that no longer asked questions, and he turned it in his fingers before slipping it into his coat, not as something hidden, but as something carried. The document followed, folded and placed beside it, both resting against his chest, close, where they belonged. For a moment, he stood there with empty hands, the table cleared, the space in front of him no longer holding answers, and yet not feeling empty at all. Outside, the last light of day stretched across the land, long shadows reaching toward the house, touching the fence, the path, the ground that had held everything without judgment, and Ethan moved toward the door again, not hesitating, not looking back. He stepped out onto the porch, the air cooler now, carrying the quiet of evening, and his gaze moved across the horizon, steady, not searching for anything, not expecting anyone to return, because what had needed to arrive had already come and gone. He rested his hand briefly on the post where the paper had been nailed that morning, the wood still marked, still bearing the trace of what had been done, and he did not remove it, did not smooth it out. He simply let it remain, a reminder not of what had been taken, but of what had been revealed. And as the light faded and the land settled into night, Ethan Cole stood there without speaking, without moving, knowing that the next part of his life would not be measured by what he held, but by what he understood. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. The night settled in slowly, the kind of quiet that does not arrive all at once, but seeps into the land inch by inch, until the sky turns deep and the world forgets the noise it carried just hours before. And Ethan remained on the porch, his hand resting lightly against the worn post, his eyes fixed on the horizon that had taken everything from him, and then, just as quietly, returned it. The wind moved softer now, brushing across the open ground like it had nothing left to carry, and for the first time since the morning began, there was no weight pressing forward, no question waiting to be answered, only the steady presence of a man standing where he belonged. He stepped down from the porch, boots meeting the dirt with a familiar sound, and walked out toward the fence line, not because he needed to check it, not because anything had changed out there, but because it felt right to stand on the edge of it again, to see it not as a boundary, but as something earned, something understood. The land stretched wide under the fading light, untouched, patient, the same as it had always been, and Ethan let his gaze move across it slowly, taking in the details he had once overlooked, the slight dip in the ground near the north end, the way the wind curved around the far ridge, the quiet places where nothing seemed to grow but everything still belonged. His hand slipped into his coat, not out of habit, but with purpose, and he felt the ring there, the document, the weight of the case, all resting against him like a quiet reminder that what mattered most was never loud, never obvious. It was carried, passed, revealed only when a man was ready to see it. He did not take them out, did not need to, because their meaning had already settled where it belonged. Somewhere in the distance, a faint echo of hooves drifted across the night air, not close enough to see, not strong enough to follow, just a passing sound, and Ethan did not turn toward it, did not search for the rider it might belong to, because some people are not meant to be followed, only remembered in the way they leave things behind. Clara had come and gone the same way the wind moves through open land, unseen until it changes something, and though she had left without asking for anything, without staying to see what came next, her presence remained, not in the house, not in the objects she returned, but in the understanding she had placed in his hands without saying it out loud. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air cool now, carrying the scent of earth and distance, and he stepped along the fence line, running his hand lightly over the wood, feeling the marks, the age, the story written into it long before he ever claimed it as his own. He stopped near the post where the paper had been nailed that morning, the wood still marked, still bearing the small scar left behind, and he rested his hand there for a moment, not to erase it, not to fix it, but to leave it exactly as it was, because some marks are not meant to be removed, they are meant to remind. He looked out once more across the land, then back toward the house, the faint light from inside barely visible now through the window, and for a second, everything felt still in a way that did not ask for anything more. Ethan Cole did not speak, did not claim what was his, did not measure what he had regained. He simply stood there, grounded in the quiet truth that had revealed itself without force, without demand. Out here, justice does not ride in loud, does not announce itself. It arrives in silence, settles into the bones, and stays only with the man who is willing to stand still long enough to understand it. And as the night fully took the land, Ethan turned back toward the house, not as someone who had won something, but as someone who had finally learned what it meant to keep it.